Let's talk about the Demon Hunters of Titan, and talk about their elite infantry, teleport shenanigans, and Nemesis Force weapons that they can bring to the fray in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Grey Knights, and in this video I thought we'd talk through the Grey Knight Index, and a bit of an overview for the stronger and weaker choices for the faction at the moment. Currently in the early days of 10th edition 40k, Grey Knights are an army that not many people are being able to make work all that successfully. They do have some incredibly powerful detachment rules with some massive repositioning shenanigans, who are perhaps just kind of let down by some very costly datasheets that kind of take that into account, and might just struggle for enough raw muscle to destroy hard enemy targets, or be reliant on unreliable charges to get most of their damage off. I guess they'll probably be an army that Games Workshop gives some boosts to in the not too distant future, but they're certainly an army that can play very interestingly on the tabletop at the moment, an Imperial teleport force that blinks in and out of existence and jumps all over the board. In Index Grey Knights, there's the typical things that you'd find in a 40k 10th edition index. They get their Teleport Assault faction rule, that's the one that allows them to disappear at the end of the enemy turn and teleport in somewhere else in your turn. Really quite a big deal to line up repeated alpha strikes and take the fights to exactly where the enemy's weakest. Definitely adds a whole ton of strength to the army. Their launch detachment is the Teleport Strike Force. The core rule for this one is Teleport Shunts. These ones are an advanced roll buff that gives you an extra 6-inch movement and fly, perhaps a little bit questionable in terms of value I think. Then 6 Stratagems, quite a lot of them based around teleport tactics and powerful movement shenanigans. 4 Enhancements, most of them at least fairly usable. And then the section of their datasheets, mainly their infantry with the Strike Marine profile and the Terminators, plus some support vehicles and their Dread Knights. I'll also mention the couple of Grey Knight units from the Imperial Armour Index as well. As mentioned, at the moment they do seem to be initially struggling quite a bit in Warhammer 40k 10th edition, probably need a little bit of balance help with some points reductions on a few of their units. In particular, a lot of their damage profiles just really struggle to deal with things like knights or heavy armour, often wounding them on a 6+. In theory, I guess it should probably be the Dread Knights that are handling those kind of profiles, but they just don't really seem to be very up to the task for the points cost that they are at the moment. And it means that there's going to be some games that are probably no-win situations, even with massive positioning advantages, unless your opponent makes big mistakes. I feel like they probably are one of the harder armies in Warhammer 40k to play right at the moment. Not a lot of raw strength, but massive advantages with putting your units exactly where you need to be. You might be in a bit more control of the game than the opponent is in some ways, but it might not necessarily help unless you've actually got the ability to remove the right units and make the exact right decisions and try and protect everything else from getting hit back. With their tournament win rate where it is in the high 30s, I suspect that in the next balance pass Games Workshop helps out a few of their units with some points cuts. Getting onto their rules though, and certainly I feel like the biggest and most important one is Teleport Assault, the Grey Knight's ability to jump around the battlefield. The way it works is that this one triggers at the end of your opponent's turn. When you reach that part of the battle round, you can basically select up to the number of units listed on this table, say 3 units if you're playing a 2000 point Strike Force game. Take those units off the table, provided they're not in engagement range with enemy units, and put them back into Teleport Assault Reserve. Then it'll be your turn, and the units reappear basically via Deep Strike, setting up 9 inches away horizontally from any enemy models. So essentially throughout the game you can have repeated alpha strikes on enemy units, potentially focusing a whole bunch of force to pick apart one part of the enemy's army, or making sure that none of your units are ever really too far out of position. If they're not going to be able to threaten the enemy force, they can go back up into the sky and drop down again. And bear in mind that as per that rules commentary FAQ thing that they did, they still have to test Battle Shock if they're depleted units. You can't escape from it just by putting them up into the sky for a phase. It means they basically have to test the Battle Shock when they get set up again. As a rule, I do think that it's very, very strong. I feel like it will be a massive advantage to the Grey Knight army overall. Though even when this was revealed, I did feel like it was only going to help the army up to a point, and clearly even with this sort of rules it's not enough to overcome the core weaknesses of the faction now, at least for most people. Perhaps some of the biggest advantages is that you can alpha strike one section of the board, get a whole load of Grey Knights down and do some close range shooting and risk some big charges. It can be great late game for catching up for far-flung objectives, or just mid-game for jumping around the board doing all the tactical objectives in the world. That seems quite nice for a little bit of defeat in detail. Any isolated enemy units could get picked on in some very unfair fights, with some Grey Knight Terminators striding out of nowhere to cut them down, then blinking off somewhere else. That being said though, without the datasheets to back it up, I did feel like it was a little bit overhyped really. Some armies are just going to be able to screen out an enormous amount on the board, so it might still just amount to just running up to the opponent's front line anyway. When you drop down, a lot of the time it's just going to be Grey Knights units opening fire with some Storm Bolters and maybe some Psy Cannons, and then attempting some 9-inch charges, which more often than not you're probably going to fail, even with command point rerolls. It means they can certainly threaten a lot of charges, but not all of them might come off and it might be a bit random. I think there's going to be quite a lot of times where you just don't really even want to reposition. Say if you've got units that are already on midfield objectives and fighting for their lives with enemy troopers, you don't generally want to have them disappear off the board, as you're just going to give the objective to the opponent and you might not have something else to countercharge with them again. Even if you can potentially teleport most of your army just about anywhere it wants to go, you still are going to actually have to commit to fights and win them, even if you might hopefully get a boost with the initial Alpha Strike. I'm genuinely not saying that it's a bad ability though, particularly with some of the datasheet abilities that feed into it. You could certainly have a good few turns of massive frustration for your opponent, particularly if your charges come off and they can get into the right units that they need to. As I said, I do feel like it's an army that's got a high skill ceiling. If you know how to play them perfectly and know the exact right positions to drop all your units and have a really good battle plan for planning for the turn ahead and keep all your units safe, I think in general it's going to be a lot easier and you might well be able to defeat a lot of mid-tier armies, but you might still struggle against the very nastiest stuff perhaps. Moving on to their launch detachment though, and this basically doubles down on teleport movement shenanigans for the Grey Knights. It's the Teleport Strike Force detachment, and quite a few of the abilities, as per its name, do really tie in with the main faction ability. I'd say that the actual detachment special rule is maybe a little bit underwhelming, but some of the enhancements and stratagems are very good. The detachment special rule gives your units the ability to teleport Shunt up the board. If you advance a unit, then you get to just add 6 inches to their movement characteristic, you don't have to roll, and they also gain the fly keyword, so gets to move straight through enemy models, though it might not help things like Dread Knights very much with terrain these days in the way that the fly keyword has changed and you have to go up and over, even if that doesn't really make much sense due to teleporting. While it's another interesting option, I feel like it's got somewhat bad synergy with the main faction rule. You can't use both this and teleport assault in the same turn, as you're either deep striking or advance moving. I think in at least a few situations, they could both just be basically used to achieve the same thing, so it may be a little bit redundant sometimes. For the best uses, I guess it could be good to jump straight onto midfield objectives turn 1, and including onto objectives that are maybe held by a little enemy screening unit that's screening out your deep strike troops. That could be quite nice to move up and snatch it off them. Or maybe just setting up some units right into the mid board in the first turn where they might be out of threat range, and then being in a position to launch a counter charge or something like that after the enemy's moved up. Could be quite a nice option to get to things for tactical objectives as well. The biggest downside of advancing though is that it prevents the vast majority of units from either shooting or charging after, so you're going to be sacrificing any of your damage to be able to do this. There aren't really all that many options to mitigate this in the Grey Knights Codex as well. There's a 1 command point stratagem to use this and still shoot and get a +1 to hit to the shooting as well. That does seem usable enough if the extra 6-inch movement is valuable enough, and also it seems to work quite well for the regular Dread Knights right now. They get advanced shoot and charge innately, so this is basically just a nice flat boost to their movement. Still though, I definitely rate this as far less powerful than the main faction rule. Some of the stratagems I think really are quite interesting though. Radiant Strike is a pricey melee boost, devastating wounds in the fight phase for your psychic weapons. Powerful enough against high saves or invulnerable saves. Usually Grey Knights are going to be hitting with AP2 and Damage 2 Nemesis Force weapons. I think if this was 1 CP, it'd be very interesting. At 2 CP, it's a bit more borderline. That's a lot of resources that could have been spent for greater things elsewhere, I think. If melee damage is just absolutely critical against something with really high saves though, doesn't seem the worst. Prognosticated Arrival is 1 command point, and I think this one is absolutely great. Arrive from deep strike or teleport assault anywhere that's greater than 3 inches from the enemy, but like lots of other similar options, it does forbid you from charging. I think this one's very nice to have access to, means that you can just throw a Grey Knight unit exactly where you need it, and potentially some very scary ones as well, things like Terminators or Paladins, to turn up and just fire off a whole load of Stormbolter shots against some light infantry nearby. Seems pretty excellent for taking big chunks out of enemies on objectives, or even dropping a massive threat into the enemy backfield for them to have to deal with. And if the opponent's hanging out with their units on the edge of an objective, you could potentially just completely take it off them. You might have enough distance to get enough objective control points and take that point. This one's really quite a powerful one I think, and works absolutely great with the faction special rule. Next for 1 CP we've got a shooting one called Death from the Warp, 1 command point for if you've either advanced, deep struck or teleport assaulted this turn. You get a +1 to hit with your ranged weapons, so usually a +25% damage boost there. And you also gain the assault keyword, relevant if you're advanced with the detachment special rule. Really quite handy if you do need that extra movement. You don't have to sacrifice your storm bolters or your special weapon shooting, and you get a damage boost to boot. Even for deep strikers and things though, looks like it'd be handy enough for units like purifiers with loads of shots, or perhaps great big blocks of Terminators with a bunch of storm bolters and some extra special psi weapons. Next up is a pretty powerful disruptive one called Haloed and Soulfire. Again, this one is coming in from reserves, either deep strike or teleport assault, and this one's one to basically make enemy shooting against that unit kind of useless for a turn. It kind of gives them the rule quite similar to a lone operative type special rule. Enemy units can't shoot this squad when they're attacks greater than 12 inches away. You do have to declare this when your unit sets up though, so it's not something that you can just use reactively if your opponent shoots them. And again, it is really quite a pricey option at 2 command points, so you would basically be giving up other good options for this. Still though, I feel like against the right army in the right situation, this could be a massive power play. Maybe have a Terminator unit come down on one flank of an enemy gun line, take out a bunch of units, and then foil the rest of the gun line from shooting at them by having this stratagem. And it could also be one that you could just use as big investment to score an objective completely out in the open. Say if the enemy can't reach your unit but could have gunned them down easily with long range weapons. If you can spare the CP, this could be a way to keep them alive for guarantees. Next up, I feel like perhaps one of the best stratagems is Mists of Deimos. This one's a really powerful disruptive one, which happens if the enemy moves within 9 inches of any of your Grey Knight Psyker units, and then for 1 command point you can either just have your squad just completely disappear, put them back into strategic reserve to deep strike again next turn, or make a reactive 6-inch move, perhaps most importantly moving them behind terrain so the enemy just can't shoot them, or moving directly backwards so the enemy might not be able to charge them and make their charge distance far longer. I think this one's definitely one that could make playing Grey Knights a really quite frustrating game. The opponents would have to actually choose not to move within 9 inches of a unit if they definitely want to deal damage to it this turn. I guess in an ideal world you could have had, say, a big Terminator unit jump down, shoot something and charge something, then when the enemy moves near them they just disappear back off the table once again. The only main restriction is that you have to be out of engagement range, so if you did charge something, you'd have to make sure that you killed it. I feel like for just 1 command point, this one's probably one of the most powerful Grey Knight stratagems and will get used really quite a lot. Maybe a bit of a gotcha one just to make sure that your opponent's aware of at the start of the game though. Definitely a bit of a surprising ability that triggers if you just move nearby any Psyker unit. Finally, we've got the True Silver Armour, 1 command point for essentially the same thing as the Space Marines get, worsening enemy AP by -1 when they target a unit. Really quite powerful with the 2+ saves that basically every standard Grey Knight gets, and also really good with how easy it is to get the benefit of cover in 10th edition as well. You might be able to guarantee a lot of Grey Knights keeping their 2+ save, or at least saving on a 3. I'd say that's definitely solidly usable. If you've got a big Terminator block that's about to take some heavy firepower, could well be worth it to have them saving on 3s rather than 4s perhaps. Overall, I feel like the Grey Knight stratagems are generally quite powerful. Probably my favourite ones are the Mists of Deimos for that redeploy, True Silver Armour for some nice extra durability, and the Prognosticated Arrival for arriving greater than 3 inches away. Haloed with Soulfire does seem absolutely devastating in the right matchup as well, but a bit less useful if you're playing against foes with lots of good melee. Finally, for their launch detachment rules, we've got the Enhancements. First to the fray is 35 points, and this one is essentially a Grey Knight Deep Strike on turn 1. You don't count towards any sort of mission reserve limits if they're in place, and your unit can set up in the reinforcement step of your first, second or third movement phase regardless of mission rules. The first one obviously being the one that you actually want to go for, as you could just put them in Deep Strike normally if you were coming down turn 2 or 3. Quite a nice one to start the Alpha Strikes going right from the get-go with the Grey Knights. Definitely could be pretty intimidating to have a Terminator unit deep strike right on the first turn and take a chunk out of the enemy army, and then quite likely get the opportunity to fade away with Mists of Deimos if they want to perhaps, as they'll probably have to move up next to that unit if they want to start getting towards midfield objectives. It's perhaps a bit more useful if you happen to be actually going first yourself as opposed to going second, as I guess if you're going second you get to take a bunch of units off the board and redeploy them anyway. So I guess while this is adding to the amount of units that you could do that with, it's perhaps not quite as pivotal. Still seems like a pretty good one though. Really nice to get some teleport action if you happen to be the player going first. The Domina Liber Demonica is 20 points, and this one gives you a +1 to wound in melee and +1 damage against any demons that you might be fighting, the second bit being far more niche than the first. I guess it's an okay enough damage boost, could be okay on a Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knight perhaps. I feel like maybe it's not quite as much use as a few of the others though. Next up, and perhaps one of the best on the list in my opinion, is the Sigil of Exigence. This one very much keeps the same flavour as it had in 9th edition. When you shoot a unit, you basically get to immediately teleport the unit elsewhere, put it somewhere on the table greater than 9 inches away from the enemy, ideally somewhere where it can both be a threat on your next turn and also be safe from enemy firepower so the unit doesn't just get gunned off the board. I guess perhaps the ideal might be to redeploy a unit somewhere where it's close enough to be able to threaten a charge on something the next turn. Though I guess you could just pull the unit back, put it somewhere completely safe, and just redeploy again via teleport assault. Kind of interesting that you could potentially use this in melee as well if you get shot at with pistols or anything. That could maybe be a bit of a surprise there. I think for 30 points that one seems basically auto-include, almost certainly going to give you a big advantage with one unit that's taking some damage. Finally, for 15 points we've got Inescapable Wrath. This one gives you a +1 to the charge rolls, really quite excellent value on a character for 15 points I think, as Grey Knights might often want to be doing 9-inch charges with the teleport assault. It means that rather than having something like a 27% chance to make the charge out of Deep Strike, it'd go up to a 42% chance, and ups the value of investing a command point reroll in that as well, going up to a 2/3 chance if you can spare one of those to make the charge. Definitely still doesn't guarantee things out of Deep Strike, but for 15 points on potentially a very valuable unit with a bunch of Terminators, seems pretty worth it. I guess maybe the turn-off to that one might be how many generic characters you've got leading squads versus things like Caldor Drago or Castellan Crow and people. If you want the Sigil of Exigence plus the First to the Fray on 2 units for example, then this one might not quite make the cut as a minor thing unless you've got say another Brotherhood Librarian leading a Terminator squad or something. Overall though, definitely not bad on the enhancement. I feel like the Sigil of Exigence is probably my favourite. Maybe First to the Fray as the next one just for the power of turning things up turn 1. And the other two seem kind of fine for the lower cost. Overall, I feel like the Teleport Strike Force isn't too bad a detachment. I feel like most of its strength comes from the Stratagems and the enhancement though, as opposed to the 6-inch advance thing. Definitely feels like a formation that focuses on shenanigans and keeping your Grey Knight units safe or having them turn up in unexpected places. Getting onto datasheets for the Grey Knights though, and for battle line keyword units, you've got Strike Squads and Brotherhood Terminators. You can take a few more of those if you'd like to, and the Strike Squads are perhaps notable as well, having the Scout keyword as well, so if you do want some midfield presence right from turn 1, they'd be an option. From 9th edition, the majority of their rosters remained fairly intact. The biggest changes are things like the Brotherhood Ancient and Apothecary just being rolled into the core Terminator datasheets now, though only the Brotherhood Terminator squad can get the Apothecary, not the Paladins. For a few overall common themes on the datasheets, in general the Psychic phase being replaced by abilities and things is a big trend of 10th edition. Definitely makes them feel like a very different flavour of army from before. Certainly a lot less psychic damage coming out of the army, other than a few choice units like the Brotherhood Librarian or the Purifiers. Things generally tend to be a bit more about buffing the individual units now. It does mean that less core abilities are likely to get scuppered by the enemy denying them somehow, though there are quite a lot of the things in the game that can get big bonuses against killing psychic units, and anything like that's going to be pretty bad news going into a Grey Knight army. Overall, for some of the bigger datasheet themes in 10th edition though, the Strike Squads all get 2+ armor saves now, the same as the Terminators, means that enemy AP0 hits are really not going to have a lot to fire at that's very efficient, and 2+ saves are kind of nice, with cover being fairly easy to get in 10th. Nemesis weapons used to have different profiles for different weapons, now they just all have the same consolidated Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2 profile, kind of similar to the Nemesis halberds from before. I think it does kind of make sense for the more basic force weapons that you have. Having slight changes to the profile often made one of them far more optimal than another, which I thought was a little bit on the pointless side. But I think it's perhaps a bit disappointing that the Nemesis Demon Hammers got rolled into that as well. It would have been really quite nice to have just a little bit more anti-tank punch for an army. Otherwise for Deep Strike and Teleport Assault, it's basically just the Infantry and Dreadnoughts that get that, none of the tanks or vehicles, nor the Dreadnought. Can definitely give you some power plays with things like Rapid Ingress for example. I think that the vast majority of Grey Knight armies are going to lean very, very heavily into units like Strike Squad equivalents and the Terminators. The rest of the index does still feel kind of peripheral. Finally, bear in mind that you can take allies for Grey Knights as well. Both assassins and small objective capping units like Exaction Squads or Voidsmen at Arms are both really good choices for the Grey Knights at time of recording. Both the Vindicare and the Calidus Assassin tend to see a lot of play, really interesting and annoying lone operative disruption units. The Calidus adds to yet more things to jump on and off the board and can mess with enemy stratagems, and the Vindicare could pop some key leaders. Having small chaff objective scoring units is absolutely massive as well. particularly when things like the Strike Squad are a princely 135 points for a unit. That's just really quite a lot to be committing either just to holding points or jumping around for tactical objectives, even if it's only for a turn when they're teleporting in and out of the place. Getting into the units individually though, and first up we have the Strike Squad, 5 to 10 models for either 135 points or 270. 27 points per model really is quite pricey, I think. I definitely feel like Games Workshop have certainly made people pay for the Teleport Assault ability just by having slightly inflated profiles for their main units, and the Grey Knight's overall positioning shenanigans are definitely represented in points costs on the table. The Strike Squads get Scout 6 inches, so you could have them move up to take midfield objectives early if you'd like to, and they have a fairly standard Space Marine profile, moving 6 inches with a toughness 4 and 2 wounds, but that very nice 2+ armor save for their nice true silver armor. Definitely a huge help against low AP attacks, that. For their ranged weapons, most of the squad get Storm Bolters, so 4 shots within 12 inches and fairly good at clearing out chaff infantry. They can take up to 1 special weapon per 5 models in the squad, though you do have to sub out the force weapon for that. Either an Incinerator with D6 auto hits at strength 6 AP 1, a Silencer with 6 shots at strength 5 AP 0 damage 1 and sustained hits, or a slightly more punchy Psy Cannon with 3 shots at strength 8 AP 1 and damage 2. I probably would take one of those and sacrifice one of the force weapons, given how easy it is to deliver Grey Knight shooting perhaps, and plus these guys might be a bit more tempting to be holding objectives as well, as opposed to trying to carry the main damage dealing in melee. Out of those, I feel like it's either going to be the Psy Cannons or the Incinerators as the way to go at the moment. Extra pure anti-infantry really isn't what the Grey Knights need, at least something with a little bit of AP. I guess in theory the Incinerator could threaten a little bit of Overwatch, though I think that the Psy Cannon would probably be my first choice. Melee-wise, they hit with their Nemesis Force weapons with that consolidated profile, 3 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. Fairly solid combat if you can deliver it, and best against things like standard Space Marines, but will struggle against anything with high toughness. I guess at least the strength 6 means that you'll be wounding most standard vehicles on a 5+, though anything with toughness 12 like Land Raiders or Knights or something will definitely give them a pause. Their special rule is Sanctifying Ritual. This allows them to basically have the sticky objectives rule, where if they control something in their command phase, then it remains under your control, even if they happen to move away or teleport off it. I think this one's really quite a nice one for giving the Grey Knights army options. They might well be disappearing and reappearing all over the map. If there's absolutely no way that your opponent can reach an objective, they could potentially safely teleport on and take the fight to somewhere different. It's also nice enough if something fails Battle Shock or if they just get shot down as well. Overall seem usable, pretty nice that they've still got good mobility with all the teleport shenanigans, and they are the cheapest power armoured bodies, and I feel like that definitely gives them a niche. They do seem to be played in small numbers in competitive lists. Next up, there's the White Helmeted Purifier Squad, 30 points per model and 5 to 10 models in the unit, a little bit more pricey than the Strikes and have a few trade-offs. The profile and their melee damage is essentially the same. They get Objective Control 1 rather than Objective Control 2. But in general they seem to excel as being quite good close-range shooting Grey Knights, getting Purifying Flame attacks, a small flurry of anti-infantry, strength 4 AP-1 shooting at 18 inches, really quite a nice extra on top of their Storm Bolter fire. They can fire both. They're also a fair bit more shooty than standard Grey Knight Strike Squads as well. They get 2 special weapons per 5 rather than 1. That does make them significantly more threatening at range between that and the Purifying Flame. They get damage boosts as the squad takes casualties, a +1 to hit if they've taken a casualty, and +1 to wound if they're below half strength. And again, they do seem to be played at least fairly commonly competitively, often with Castell and Crow in tow to give them extra purifying flame shots. Overall quite rounded damage dealers as the Strike Marine profile goes, I think. A solid amount of infantry killing shooting, and enough melee to still threaten most medium enemy units. Next up, we've got the Interceptor Squad, 5 or 10 models at either 160 or 320 points. They remain essentially Strike Marines but faster, a 12-inch move and the fly keyword from their personal teleporters, and otherwise get exactly the same profile as the Strike Marines, the same Nemesis Force weapon profile, and the same 1 special weapon per 5 of them. In place of the objective control and the sticky objectives, they instead get personal teleporters. This one is a jump shoot jump mechanic, so you could move 12 inches, shoot at some of the enemies, and then fade away behind terrain or something, or just get some absolutely excessive movement, jumping 12 inches, shooting and then jumping again another 6 inches, and you could even do that with a detachment special rule adding a further 6 to advance with that stratagem, theoretically 24 inches worth of movement if you'd like it. Again, I'd say they're usable enough, maybe a little bit less favoured than the Strike Squads at the moment, it would seem. I kind of feel like with the amount of positioning things that Grey Knights have already, then getting yet more mobility maybe isn't as desirable if you're paying a points tax for it, but still again could be a pretty big nuisance, a lot more reliable at delivering their closer range shooting and their combat. Finally, for the Strike Squad equivalents, we've got the Purgation Squad, the Grey Knights with the 4 special weapons, 5 models for 190 points, 10 models for 320. They don't double up because the first 5 get the heavy weapons and then the rest are just more sort of basic guys. Again, the similar sort of Strike Marine profile with the Objective Control 1 and the 2+ save. In general, if you're taking these, you're probably going to want 4 of the special weapons to start with, as that's the main draw to them, meaning they're not really going to have anywhere near as much combat threat as most of the rest of the units. They can take 4 of the same special weapons, and due to their indirect fire type special rule, that's probably going to be 4 Psy Cannons. I guess 12 shots at Strength 8, AP 1 and Damage 2, all firing out of line of sight, provided you can see the target of them with at least another Psyker on the board. Hopefully shouldn't be too hard with at least something ranging forward, I guess. I feel like these guys were maybe kind of usable at the previous points cost, still a bit on the pricey side for what you got I thought, but due to the indirect fire nerfs that Games Workshop handed out to a bunch of factions, these got hit by a massive great increase, so I think that they're really overcosted at 190 points compared with where they should be. Pretty weird to think that these guys cost more than the Space Marine Desolation squads right now. They could certainly have a few turns of dealing damage with a fair amount of impunity with their redeploys that they could get, but the barrage fire maybe just doesn't really have quite the same sort of value as other things in 40k. It's not exactly massively long range, and you still need to see it with at least something, both of which are fairly big limitations on top of the losing an AP and getting a -1 to hit penalty. Terminator units next, and the Brotherhood Terminator Squad is perhaps one of the better units to build around for the Grey Knights. 225 points for 5 of them, or 450 for 10. Again, these are one of the battle line units along with the Strike Marines, so you can take a bunch of the units if you'd really like to. Stats wise, they have the 10th edition Durable Terminator profile, Toughness 5, a 2+ save and 3 wounds with a big 4+ invulnerable, definitely able to take a punch and a lot more resilient to small arms. They are a little bit more pricey than most Terminators out there though, again I'd guess probably paying for the teleport assault shenanigans. They do get Objective Control 2 as well, which I guess is helpful. I guess that's probably due to them being a battle line squad, and often they'll have Objective Control 3 each, as you can replace one Stormbolter with a banner, and I feel like that is probably worth it for the extra Objective Control points compared with losing a few shots. Otherwise, for their ranged weapons, they get some Stormbolters, plus 1 special weapon per 5 that you don't need to lose the Force weapon for. Again, I'd probably go Incinerator or Psy Cannon there, perhaps the Psy Cannon would be my pick. In melee, they get the Nemesis Force weapon profile with 1 extra attack, so 4 attacks hitting on 3s. A squad of those is going to be pretty intimidating to most targets around, unless you're Toughness 12 or something. Otherwise, they get a couple of kind of helpful special rules. They're the squad that gets Hammer Hand, and that amounts to lethal hits on the charge. Really quite a big deal with their mid-strength kind of profiles. A huge deal if you're fighting against anything that you're wounding on a 5+ or a 6. And if they can charge at the enemy, it means that they're just a lot more general purpose at taking down heavy hitting threats. Finally, one of the squad can take a Narthesium to basically make yourself the Terminator Apothecary. That allows you to resurrect 1 destroyed model from the grave each turn if you've got a squad that's damaged but not destroyed. Really quite a powerful ability to be returning a 45-point model from the dead, and you could potentially position the model so it shortens the charge if they're going to make a long charge against something on the board. Overall, they do seem to be pretty strong. It seems like both they and the Paladins are favoured as the optimal squads to build around for Grey Knights these days. They've got access to a few more choices in terms of character support, and a bigger, more valuable units for things like stratagems. Otherwise, the other flavour of Terminators are the Paladin squad, a similar sort of defensive profile with the same Terminator stat line. They don't get an extra wound now or anything like that, but what they do get is a rather nice defensive buff with a -1 to wound if you do shoot them with things that are strength 6 or better. That one's really quite a powerful debuff against the type of weapons that are going to kill them the best. For the melee stat line, they get to hit on a 2+, but don't get the lethal hits on the charge. Most of the time that'll probably outcompete the lethal hits thing, but it will be a bit worse if they're literally just charging something like a tank or similar. Otherwise, they do get the Ancient Banner, so they'll be Objective Control 2, and will just go down to 1 if they're battle shocked, but they don't get the Narthesium, so no reviving Terminators over here, even if they are harder to kill in the first place. Overall, again, a fairly solid unit as Grey Knights go, generally well used by a lot of competitive lists. Definitely some advantages to building around the Paladins and the regular Terminators. I guess these are the guys that you normally want to have taking a big punch if they have to be exposed at some stage. Finally, for the infantry units, we've got the Servitors. 50 points for 4 models that can attach to a Tech Marines retinue, and he can join a strike squad with these as well. Little supporting guys with toughness 4 and a 4+ save. They get to actually hit fairly accurately with their 2 heavy weapons in the unit, either plasma cannons or multi-melters, hitting on a potentially 2+ if they're static with the Tech Marine. Might not be the worst thing in the world as an upgrade for a strike squad, getting a few heavy weapons buried in the units, plus a couple of cheap bodies to tank big anti-tank damage shots, things that probably would have killed a Grey Knight Strike Marine anyway if you'd tried to save on them. I feel like in reality though, they're going to be very rarely used. Tech Marines maybe aren't the most popular choice in the world, unless Dread Knights get really good again. And if you want a cheap little unit to sit on an objective, they could do that, but they will be competing against cheap Imperial agents like Exaction Squads or Voidsmen at Arms. Moving into the vehicles next, and first up we've got everyone's favourite baby carrier that is the Nemesis Dread Knight. 215 points, so really quite a high investment walker, toughness 8, a 2+ save, 13 wounds, and a 4+ invulnerable. It's definitely not the worst defensive profile in the world, what with 10th edition being able to get cover saves really quite easily for big vehicles like this. But that toughness 8 will mean that it's quite a lot easier to wound than a lot of other similar vehicles out there. Things like overcharged plasma is going to be far more of a threat to this than most. Movement wise, it moves 8 inches and it does get the teleport assault and deep strike, so it could potentially be teleporting around the board along with the rest of the Grey Knight squads. And its special rule is Empiric Reprisal. It gets to shoot and declare a charge in a turn when it either advanced or fell back. That one perhaps makes it one of the best users of the detachment special rule, the one where it automatically advances 6 inches. Realistically, it means that if this thing starts on the board, most of the time it's going to have a great big 14-inch movement range, and then still be able to shoot and charge after that. For its range damage, with the silencer having AP 0 again, I feel like it's probably the other two that are more tempting to go for. The heavy incinerator gets 2d6, strength 6 and AP -1 auto hits, good enough for a little bit of overwatch as well. And the heavy side cannon can at least worry enemy medium vehicles. 6 shots at strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3, at least it means that you get some big damage through if any saves are failed. Generally going to be okay firepower against the vast majority of units, but won't be very standout against anything with very high saves with only AP 1. In combat you've got the choice between the Nemesis Demon Hammer or the Greatsword. Your choice of either strength 14, AP 3 and D6+1 damage, though that one does hit on a 4+, or the sweep and strike profile of the Greatsword, either 10 attacks at strength 5 AP 1, or 5 attacks at strength 10, AP -2 and damage D6. I feel like you could probably make arguments for both of those there. The Greatsword not hitting on a 4+ is quite a big advantage. I suppose with the Great Hammer you could use Tank Shock to quite good effect. At the moment though, in terms of competitive Grey Knight army building, it doesn't seem like Dread Knights are exciting enough for people to want to bring them along all that much. Both their damage in melee, range and defense for the cost all feel kind of okay but not standout. Even with their fast movement or teleport shenanigans, I feel like they could use a points reduction. The Grey Knights also have a Dreadnought as well. The Venerable Dreadnought is 155 points, gets toughness 9, 8 wounds and a 2+ save. I feel like in general, with its damage and defense, it's perhaps not enormously outstanding for its points cost in 40k, and generally tries to justify itself by a buffing special rule. The ranged weapons are very flexible, and you can double down with a missile launcher and your choice of another gun as well if you'd like, but generally 2 heavy weapons for 155 points isn't the most exciting in the world. The combat damage is far more impressive with 5 attacks at strength 12 and damage 3, really not too bad, but it struggles to get into range with them with only a 6-inch move, and this guy doesn't get any of the army's normal teleport shenanigans. I think its buffing rule is kind of interesting though. It's an aura of re-rolling hit rolls and wound rolls of 1 for Grey Knight's infantry within 6 inches, and that does add up to a genuinely significant damage boost, usually going to be 36% damage extra at both range and in melee. I feel like if you feel like including one in the list and playing around it and making sure that you're jumping squads just into its aura, could maybe be worth it enough to include one, though I feel like you'd have to build around it, it might limit your flexibility with positioning. Overall probably a little bit inflexible, but I feel like if ranged things like Purgation Squads do get very good, this could be a very predictable way to get a lot more firepower out of them, and between that and its own damage and defensive profile might be enough to justify one. Next up for the Grey Knight's Land Raider, it's 270 points, transports 12 and does normal Land Raider things, zooming a squad up the board and then allowing them to charge out to melee with its assault ramp, while also adding a bunch of las cannon shots and a twin heavy bolter, and of course you do have the other variants on offer. I feel like compared with other armies it's just about as usable as any other Land Raider. Grey Knights do have units that could credibly use one as well. Both Purifiers, Strike Squads, or Terminators or Paladins I think could be justifiable, as you can get quite a lot of value in its transport capacity. Plus you've got enough room to take the squad plus the extra attached character and catapult them into combat. Again though, it might just be over-investing in yet more mobility things for an army that can already jump all over the table at a moment's notice. Though I feel like again, if you wanted to make one work, then you probably could. Though maybe doesn't necessarily seem much stronger with delivering them in other ways. The Grey Knights also have their other two Land Raider variants, the Land Raider Crusader with its Hurricane bolters for essentially 24 twin-linked bolter shots at close range. I feel like in general you're probably going to get more value out of the las cannon shots, particularly in an army that's quite good at killing medium and light infantry anyway. And then also there's the Land Raider Redeemer, 290 points for a whole bunch of the Flamestorm cannon shots. If you fire both of them, that's 2d6 plus 6 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. Pretty murderous to things like Space Marines. For the extra cost, and Grey Knights already having buckets of strength 6 damage 2 type attacks, again I think you're still probably going to be better off with the standard Land Raider, though I suppose it could be quite a good Overwatch threat. Otherwise for vehicles, they've also got a couple more transports and some generic Space Marine flyers. Rhinos at 80 points and work the same as they would for other factions. Transport 12 and at least reasonable durability for the cost, plus you can fire a couple of guys out the top with the firing deck, and they self-prepare if they get damaged but not killed. Again, probably a bit borderline at the moment given they're a transport for an army with masses of mobility and positioning type options. I guess again most interesting for things like Strike Marines or Purifiers potentially. Strike Marines could have them scouting up the board a little way to deliver them onto midfield objectives, and Purifiers might get a bit more value out of moving up and then jumping out to shoot, but again just when you can teleport around the place anyway, just might really not be worth spending the extra 80 points on something that doesn't deal much damage. Razorbacks are an extra 15 points over the Rhino for less transport capacity but a big gun on top. Probably either the twin las cannon for a bit of anti-tank or the twin assault cannon for some mortal wounds seem like they're the best bet to me. The Razorback special rule is to give you reroll wound rolls if you both focus down one target that you're firing at. I guess in theory that's probably best with the Purifiers or the Purgation Squad. Again though, just maybe unlikely to be all that exciting compared with just getting more Strike Squad bodies on the board and teleporting them about exactly where they need to be. Then the Grey Knights have access to the standard Space Marine flyers, the Stormhawk Interceptor, Storm Talon gunship and the Storm Raven gunship. All of these are considered pretty underwhelming in the core Space Marine Codex, and it's probably even worse for Grey Knights to be honest. They don't even get the benefit of Oath of Moment, and they really just don't fit in with their core strategy in any way. The Stormhawk Interceptor I think is a bit better than the Storm Talon, it's a bit cheaper and packs some more exciting guns in my opinion. I'll probably be most tempted by the Las Talon on the front gun at least, plus the twin-linked assault cannons could get you some mortal wounds. That one gets the +1 to hit against fly, and at least it's hover so it can start on the board. The defense really isn't good for 160 points though. The Storm Talon gunship is even more points. It does get a slightly more useful +1 to hit against things that don't fly, which is a bit better as a special rule, but it's kind of balanced with the rest of the guns being kind of underwhelming. Maybe a Typhoon missile launcher plus the twin assault cannons might be the way to go for that. Just seems like a worse proposition overall than the Stormhawk, and it even gets a point less toughness. Both of these just are maybe robbed of part of their main value of having flyers around when you can just teleport infantry to where you need to be on the battlefield anyway, particularly with the dropping close stratagem. Finally, I'd say a little bit better than the other two is the Grey Knight Storm Raven gunship. 265 points, so a fair bit more expensive, but probably a little bit more durable for the points overall. 14 wounds, toughness 10, and it gets a -1 damage baked in, so a little bit more resilient against damage 2 and damage 3 things in particular. I feel like its guns are at least fairly well balanced per point, with the Stormhawk perhaps. Some big shots with the Stormstrike missile launchers that definitely helps out with anti-tank with a big d6 plus 2 damage. Maybe a twin-linked las cannon on top, and some multi-melters that are twin-linked to get some reroll wound rolls against some tanks. And then it does back that up with some fairly decent anti-horde with a whole bunch of twin-linked Hurricane bolter shots. Between the lot of it, the damage output's not too bad, and you can have some fun transporting some things into battle. Again, doesn't really play into the Grey Knight's core strategy or anything, but you definitely get some fun and style points if you did wing around transporting a dreadnought around. Overall, I would rate the majority of the Grey Knight vehicles as just not really being all that strong at the moment. I'd still say the Dreadnought's perhaps the most interesting of them. It does move fast and can do a fair bit of threat both at range and in melee. Otherwise I feel like you could probably make a Dreadnought or a Land Raider work if you wanted to, and the transports don't really do too much different to what they'd do for other Space Marines, they just feel a bit less necessary for Grey Knights. Moving on to characters next though, and that's certainly one of the biggest sections of the Grey Knights index. The Grandmaster's 115 points and is a big tanky 7 wound Terminator character. He can lead the Brotherhood Terminator Squad and the Paladin Squad. You do have really quite a lot of options to lead these Terminator type units. He does definitely have some competition. For leading the squad, he gets 2 main abilities. First up, he gets to ignore modifiers for the unit. That's kind of situationally handy against things like stealth or anything that's going to affect their characteristics. And then once per game, his Master Strategist gives you 1 stratagem for 0 CP. Not every turn, unfortunately, like other Space Marine captains that you might be able to get. Does maybe feel a little bit mean to not allow him to do things multiple times per game like that, though I guess the teleport strikes for stratagems are very, very strong. Maybe it could be quite a nice one to shield the unit from shooting with that can't be shot at greater than 12 inches one maybe. I suppose you get more value out of ones that are more command points, but doubling up is kind of powerful as well. I guess if you wanted, you could have 2 units drop down within 3 inches of the enemy to create some massive Terminator threat overload on one area of the board, or use Mists of Deimos on 2 different Terminator units, potentially removing a whole load of things from the board that the opponent wanted to damage. Then for his own attacks, he gets 5 attacks at the standard force weapon profile. I have seen really quite a lot of lists using him. Being able to double down on 1 stratagem once per game is pretty big, and otherwise he does add a bit of muscle to the unit. Otherwise, the Brother Captain's a little bit simpler and a bit cheaper, 95 points, and he gives the unit sustained hits 1, often a 25% damage increase, though it only applies to psychic weapons so it doesn't affect Stormbolters. Otherwise, he has 1 less wound than the Grandmaster, but maybe isn't so very different. He gets 1 less attack in combat, though does make up for it for re-rolling wound rolls at range and melee with psychic weapons, so overall I think that adds up to a bit more damage out of him compared with the Grandmaster. Again, I think it's usable enough, but probably not quite as standout. I feel like that once per game free stratagem might genuinely have more impact, as they could potentially save an entire Terminator squad's life in the right situation. Next up, and perhaps one of the more exciting buffing characters, is the Brotherhood Librarian, 110 points, again joining one of the flavours of Terminator units, and for that you get a 5 wound character with an AP-1 melee weapon, so not quite as much raw might in combat. The Librarian gets a Stormbolter and doesn't get to trade it out for one of the psi weapons like the Captain or Grandmaster, but instead gets a psychic shooting attack called Purge Soul, a single shot Witchfire with damage 3 that maybe could melt a Terminator or something. You can make it precision if that matters for a hazardous check, but definitely the biggest thing that it brings to the unit is the Vortex of Doom, a 2+ chance to just throw out 2d3 mortal wounds against one enemy unit within 18-inch range. It's not technically a shooting attack either, so it means that you could use this if you're advanced or fallen back. And I don't believe that there's anything to stop you hitting lone operatives with it either, so you could melt a Vindicare assassin or something. It is a pretty strong damage dealer, though it could be very swingy. Most of the time you're getting your, on average, 4 mortal wounds on your target, though every so often is going to get unlucky and do d6 mortal wounds to your own unit, though every so often going nuts, rolling a 6, and getting 2d6 mortal wounds on the enemy squad, potentially some catastrophic damage there. Finally, he also gets a Sanctic Hood as well, giving the unit a full plus feel no pain against psychic attacks. Could be relevant in some matchups like Thousand Sons or Tyranids, and at least I think that from the rules from the designer's commentary, it would work against the mortal wounds caused by Vortex of Doom from his own attack. I believe that that one checks out, but if it's any different, feel free to let me know down in the comments and I'll post a correction. Overall though, just 4 reliable mortal wounds being chucked out of his unit, he appears to be one of the more competitive picks for the Grey Knights. Seems to be quite a staple, leading small squads of Terminators or Paladins around the board. Finally, for the generic Terminator characters, we've got the Brotherhood Chaplain. He's the cheapest at 90 points, and he's a bit more predictable as a melee damage buff. He gives you a +1 to wound in melee, which is kind of nice with their mid-strength Nemesis weapons with strength 6. Definitely makes them a whole load more threatening to things like Imperial Knights or vehicles. Otherwise, he also debuffs enemy battle shock slightly, which I think is kind of niche, and chips in with a few Crozius attacks as well, though in general he just helps out with melee. I think he's usable enough, maybe perhaps most interesting on a reserve squad that had rapid ingress perhaps. Seems like one of the most likely ways to deliver a squad to melee. Could be interesting to have that +1 to charge ability on him as well. A harder hitting squad in combat that's a bit more likely to make the charge out of teleport compared with some of the others. Then rounding off the generic character picks, we've got a couple of strike profile units, plus the Grandmaster and Nemesis Dread Knight. The Brotherhood Champion's 85 points and can lead either the Purgation Squad or Strike Squad, but sadly he can't join the Purifiers. That's kind of annoying, as I feel like they're maybe a bit better as big damage investment squads over strikes potentially. Strike squads really are the only choice for him though, as purgation squads just don't make sense. As in any case, he's a 4 wound character with a 4+ invulnerable save that sort of has champion style attacks, 5 attacks hitting at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, with precision for killing enemy characters and big rerolls against them, and overall definitely most useful for giving the unit fights first, so if you've got a unit on an objective and the opponent needs to charge them to kill them, you get to hit them first and hopefully deal a whole bunch of damage. Overall definitely a powerful ability. Against anything that he gets the rerolls against, he is going to be pretty mighty. Lots of things do get the character keyword if they've got attached characters. I guess if you wanted to give Strike Marines a character and maybe to have an enhancement with them, then he's probably the first choice right now. Otherwise, if you wanted a bit of vehicle support, the Brotherhood Tech Marines 85 points. He can either lead Servitors, a strike squad, or just run as a lone operative and run along with vehicles. Again, he's 4 wounds at toughness 4 with a 2+ save, a more power armoured profile with a servo harness. I must admit I find it kind of interesting that he is actually kind of weirdly strong in melee. If you just literally want a whole load of damaging attacks in the units, then he does that very well. 4 attacks at strength 6 and damage 2 from his power axe, then an extra 2 attacks with his plasma cutter, and an extra 2 attacks that are damage 3 and strength 8 with his servo arm as well. 8 attacks in total, all with multi-damage and mid-strength. That's not too bad to add into the unit full stop. On top of that, he also gets a bit of shooting with a flamer as well, and of course his main thing is helping out vehicles, giving them a +1 to hit and regenerating some lost wounds of them. They both have to happen in the command phase though, so maybe aren't quite as helpful if he's going to go teleporting around with a unit. Overall, just in terms of raw value, I feel like he's probably got enough there to make him quite interesting, just maybe a little bit problematic to actually use all of that at once. He feels like a unit who actually wants to be in combat to make use of his surprisingly good combat profile, but also buffing vehicles at the same time somehow, and he might well struggle to keep up with Dread Knights if they're zooming around at 14-inch move each turn with their advanced special rule. Finally, for the generic characters, we've got the big Dread Knight one, the Grandmaster and Nemesis Dread Knights for 245 points, and broadly speaking he's got pretty much the same profile as a regular Dread Knight, just with his special rules being altered and switched around a bit. It means that overall, for the points and damage and defense, he's a bit less threatening than the regular one, unless you're giving him that enhancement for a +1 to wound or something, as you're basically getting the same stat line but for a few points more. His special rules, though, are to trade out the advanced shoot and charge ability that most Dread Knights get, so it will be quite a lot slower and maybe more reliant on teleports to get him into battle. And then his main ability is a big anti-monster and vehicle one. Once per battle round in the fight phase, he gets to reroll all hits, wounds and damage against monsters or vehicles, genuinely making him really quite a big threat against even quite big stuff. I guess he might be a bit more tempted to take the Nemesis Demon Greathammer as a result, and allow him to really go to town on things like enemy knights. Against a toughness 12 3+ save knights with this active, he'd do around about 15 wounds, so really can do some pretty amazing damage if you can get him into combat with them. Should be able to handle the vast majority of normal sized vehicles in a single round of fighting. Otherwise he also gets a heroic intervention rule, which I think is a bit more niche, 1 CP to heroic intervene rather than 2. Occasionally it might come up, but it's not going to be all that often. He is a character as well, so he can take enhancements, quite a few of them are tempting for him, I guess. I still think that probably things like the Sigil of Exigence this time round are probably better on big units as opposed to just this guy though. Finally, for the characters, we've got the Grey Knight special character cast led up by Caldor Drago. The big Supreme Grandmaster of the Grey Knights is 155 points, and he's got a similar sort of profile to the regular Grandmasters, a 7 wound character with a 4+ invulnerable save. Looks like the Titan Shield isn't really giving him all that many extra benefits on the durability front. His melee is very nicely threatening though, 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 4 and damage 3, very solid at killing medium and heavy infantry, and definitely threatening to tougher stuff that he's wounding on 5s as well. He also gets the anti-demon 2+ keyword on all his attacks, so he's good at killing his most hated foes. He also gets that on his psychic shooting attack called Scourging, which is best suited to killing enemy heavy infantry with strength 6 and damage 2 there. Just as a thought, for the Titan Sword being anti-demon, if you do flex into that stratagem for devastating wounds in melee, that's going to absolutely ruin any demon that you get in close combat with. Otherwise though, he gives his unit a 4+ save against mortal wounds, which genuinely is very helpful on Grey Knight Terminators. It's going to be one of the best ways to kill them, particularly paladins. And then perhaps his single best special rule I think is his one with the warp special rule. This is one where if he arrives from Deep Strike Reserve, he gets to add 3 to the charge roll, so you're going to be charging the enemy on a 6-inch charge normally, Usually that'd be an 83% chance, going up to a big 97% chance if you budget a command point for the reroll. I'd say that more than anything is perhaps the biggest thing, means that he's almost certainly going to get the charge with him plus the melee of a Terminator squad of some sort into combat, and that's going to give you a really good chance of just wiping out one enemy unit out of reserve without them being able to do very much about it. Overall very strong and well worth the cost I think. I'd rate him as one of the strongest Grey Knight HQs at the moment. Otherwise, for special characters, we've got Grandmaster Voldus, 115 points, and a 6 wound Terminator character. He's also got perhaps surprisingly punchy melee, hitting at strength 10, AP 2, and damage 3. Definitely good for lending your squad a hand against the tougher targets out there like vehicles. Kind of a shame that regular Demon Hammers didn't get this sort of profile. His special rule is Sanctuary. This one's turned into a -1 to hit the unit now, so quite a nice survivability unit. Again, could be pretty useful on Paladins. -1 to hit and -1 to wound for tough stuff. Otherwise, his second special rule just gives you a coin flip chance at a few more mortal wounds in the fight phase. Not nothing, but maybe not standout. I feel like in general is kind of fine. Definitely helps out the unit in combat and makes them a bit tougher. Seems perfectly usable, but is definitely competing against a whole load of other characters, a lot of which are very good, and some of which can bear good enhancements, so you might be more tempted by the generic version. Lastly, for the Terminator characters, we've got Brother Captain Stern. He's a 6 wound Terminator character, a fairly standard attack profile with 5 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 6. Rather than getting the exploding 6s to hit for the unit, he instead has 6s to wound get an additional mortal wound, and unlike devastating wounds they get that in addition to normal damage. I'd argue that's really quite a powerful buff to be honest, and often is going to be better against devastating wounds at a fair few targets. If you're already saving on a lowish number, you've got a good chance of taking 2 wounds plus the mortal wound from it, which is kind of nice. Seems usable enough. Again, you'd want it on a squad that you'd want to deliver into combat, maybe using something like Rapid Ingress to get them there perhaps. Maybe in a way he might be competing slightly with the Terminator Chaplain for that. Whether or not he's worth the extra 20 points for his different melee profile and that rule I guess is up to you. Otherwise, his second special rule I think is at least fairly good. When he dies the first time, you have a 2+ chance to resurrect with 4 wounds remaining, a 6 wound Terminator character just rising from the ashes. That could be quite nice if, say, the opponent charged and kills your Terminator squad, he gets up and gets a full turn to do what he wants next turn, hopefully should drag down a few more opponents with him. It is kind of gambling on your Terminator unit being wiped though, so it's more of a making the best of a bad situation type rule as opposed to something that's actually going to help them when they are alive. I'd probably say he's a little bit more niche compared with some of them, maybe not enormously standout. Finally for the characters, we've also got Castellan Crow, the unique Purifier character, and also the most recent model in the Grey Knight range at time of recording. He's 95 points and is the only choice for leading a Purifier squad. He gets himself a 5 wound profile with a 4+ invulnerable save, so kind of similar to things like a Space Marine Captain there perhaps. I feel like it's a solid enough boost to his units, both with the Purifying Flame shooting, and he's got some okay combat as well. He gets his own Purifying Flame attack that gets 3 attacks rather than just 1 and hitting on a 2+, so chipping in a bit more anti-infantry firepower there. And on top of that, he also means that the entire squad gets more Purifying Flames as well. They all add +1 to their attacks characteristic, so in a 10-man Purifier squad, that'd be 20 shots at strength 4, AP 1 and anti-infantry, plus his own attacks, which I think he'd also get +1 to as well. Quite a lot of shooting in addition to 4 of those special weapons as well, and a bunch of Stormbolters. Definitely a unit that's going to chew through the vast majority of infantry there. In combat his melee is quite nice as well. 5 attacks with strength 6, AP 2, damage 2, devastating wounds and precision is fairly good, going to chip in against most things, and when the squad gets very depleted or he starts getting attacked by sniper weapons or something, he gets to negate 1 save and make it damage 0. Handy enough for him trying to cling to life in the last few gasps. Overall I think he's fairly solid, and again I've definitely seen him played in some competitive Grey Knight lists, leading a big squad of Purifiers into battle. Finally, and going outside of the core index, we've also got the Forge World choices, the Land Raider Banisher and the Grey Knight's Thunderhawk. The Land Raider Banisher is one of the cheaper Land Raiders, 255 points and transports 12. This one's pretty much just got the standard Land Raider profile, but just different weapons, so it could be interesting enough if you wanted some heavy incinerators on the sponsons. I'd probably see it as a cheapo version of the Land Raider Redeemer, 46 strength 6 AP 1 and damage 1 shots at 18-inch range, plus some twin-link Psy cannons to take some chunks out of enemy heavies. Could be pretty punchy against enemy infantry on Overwatch. Definitely a threat to have this parked within range of an objective, means that you could just clear entire squads of light troops trying to take some points I suppose. It will be a bit worse than the Redeemer against any heavy infantry like Space Marines moving around, but then it's quite a lot cheaper as well with 35 points less. Overall I was rated as usable. I still think that maybe the big anti-tank shots of the regular Land Raider might be the best, but probably better than the Crusader in my opinion due to the AP and auto hitting. Finally, we've got the Grey Knight's Thunderhawk gunship, 805 points worth of very expensive 412 resin, this thing being a great big transport flyer with a capacity of 30, and the idea would be that it starts on the board, hovers over 20 inches, and then gets a whole load of Grey Knights out. If they've got the deep strike rule, then it means that they can get out and then also charge. It is at least fairly tough to take out individually at toughness 12 or 2 plus save and 30 wounds, though that's not exactly very good per point for 800 plus points. It does have a few fun guns, including an enormous D6 plus 6 damage turbo laser destructor, though realistically it's just a bit overcosted for what it really brings to the table. I'd certainly rate this one as a bit more of a big fun model for more casual, huge games. So anyway, with the 412 stuff talked about, that brings us to the end of Index Grey Knights, and a quick talk through all the options available to the Knights of Titan. I feel like overall their rules do seem quite interesting, and Games Workshop have made them play in a very different way to how they have done in the past, though at the moment it's obviously not really quite coming together for them. They're definitely a harder faction than most to win with, their sheer amount of positioning advantages and jumping around the board not seeming to quite outweigh how much their points cost for what they do on the board. Though I do feel like if Games Workshop do drastically drop the points cost, it's an army that could very swing between kind of underwhelming to incredibly dominant, and probably the window for balance is perhaps a little bit thin. In the meantime though, looks like perhaps some of the better options are to build around the Terminators and Paladins for the core damage of the army, and maybe think about backing them up with some small numbers of either Strike Squads or Purifiers, maybe the Purifiers alongside Castell and Crow potentially. Dread Knights just seem a little bit on the overcosted side, they probably aren't quite unusably bad. And I feel like they've done at least a fairly good job of balancing the various different Grey Knights characters. Out of the current cast, I'm perhaps most convinced by Caldor Drago, Brotherhood Librarians, and Grandmasters for the Big Three stratagem. I think that basically the entire cast of the rest of the characters really isn't all that far behind that, and all seem fairly usable. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on playing Grey Knights in game at the moment, what's been working out for you and what hasn't, and feel free to mention anything that I've missed or got wrong here. If I've made any particularly big errors, then I'll post a pinned correction down in the comments below. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.